Well, up till now, I've been sharing with you poems and songs written by various authors of different periods, both in my videos and in my podcasts. But today I wanted to share with you a couple of my own poems. I thought you might be interested in those. They've been being collected over a lifetime. Very few have ever seen print, but I hope to share them with a live audience and give them a kind of new existence. I've been writing them since I was a teenager, and I've probably in my life written 1,000 poems, and I've got it reduced down to a few score of poems that I think are preservable or have some interest. One thing that you will recognize when you hear these poems is that I have been and am still a Platonist in my metaphysical prejudice. I won't go into this in the greatest detail today, but it might appear as we go along to be something true. The two poems which I'm about to talk about are both from a section of my early poems written in my mid and later 20s called Platonica. Platonica meaning poems of Platonic, on a Platonic subject matters. And in order to understand them, I have to tell you something about Plato's philosophy, although we can't today do a exhaustive or detailed description of that, because that would take a great deal of energy and time, and we may come back to that in the future. Plato believes in a theory, a metaphysical theory, which has been adopted not only by himself but by numerous subsequent thinkers, Plotinus, to some extent Augustine, some modern thinkers. And the theory is, in a nutshell, that all particular existences, all substances or entities that you see in the world are really made intelligible and have their underlying existence through an immaterial form. That is, this principal immaterial existence which exists separate from them in an eternal territory, and that the world we see that's moving and changing is a kind of picture at a distance. It's a moving portrait of the eternal. So there's really an above and below. There's an eternal world in which each object, animal, plant, universal idea like color and every other thing that you could think of has its existence in this eternal sphere, this unchanging sphere. And it's from that unchanging sphere that the changing objects that we see, the examples of changing objects we see in life, the individual squirrel, the individual human or book or star, or whatever it might be, that they all get their existence, their basis, and what makes them knowable from this immaterial form in this, as it were, other world, the second world. Plato thought that there was a divine artisan who carries or forces the immaterial forms through a receptacle, which is like a kind of great doorway between the material and the immaterial world. And by forcing the forms through the receptacle, they take on matter. And when they take on matter, they're individuated and they become the things we see in everyday life, the thousands of examples of each object. But all the squirrels in the world, according to Plato's view, have the form of squirrel behind them. They're all participating, unbeknownst to themselves, I suppose, in this immaterial, invisible, eternal squirrel. Now, it sounds like a fantastic theory, even when I'm telling you this. And it sounds like it doesn't solve any problems, but actually it solves numerous problems of how we know and how we can be sure that things have a nature. And perhaps on another day we'll go into that detail. But a simple way to say it, since I'm now giving this little instruction, a simple way to say it is, if you ask the question, what is a chair, which philosophers love to mention chairs, I guess because they sit in them all the time when they're reading. But what is a chair? If you ask that question, Plato very simply asks the question, can we say it's a thing made of a certain thing? Is it something made of metal? Is it something made of stone? Is it something made of wood? And the answer is no, because it's made of all those. And it can be made of anything you could think of. Okay, well, can it be defined by its use? And the answer to that is no, because a chair can be used to stand on, to get books off a shelf. It can be used for royal purposes. It can be used for a chair just by existing as itself does not demand a particular use, it doesn't have to be a certain kind of tool, although in the chair's case, it's more obvious that it might be used that way. And you can go down the list of all the things the chair could be determined by: its material, its appearance, its use, and any category you could think of. And Plato says none of those are sufficient to tell us why a chair is a chair and not a dog or something else. And he says once we've reduced the chair to the point where we see all the things that could define it as chair, we realize the only thing that can define it as chair is chair itself. That being a chair is the thing that defines the members of the class chairs. Now, this seems like circular reasoning, but what he says is that must mean there's one single chair in which all the other chairs participate in order to have their chairness, their chair quality. Otherwise, they couldn't have, because appearance, use, material, and other things are not definitive and are suspicious ways of defining them. They must therefore have some underlying chair, and that chair to be unchanging, universal, and being in all chairs must be non-particular, non-material, and in a sense even non-useful. But it must be simply the idea of a chair, but that idea cannot be in the human mind because we don't believe that objects exist because we think about them. That sounds like solipsism. So they must be in a realm of ideas independent of all other objects. They must exist on their own. And the thing that exists on its own is this form. The eidos is what he calls it, okay? And therefore our whole moving temporal sphere of existence is just a picture, a reflection. Time is the moving likeness of eternity. That's because all the objects in the temporal realm are the moving likeness of their forms. Okay, well, that's a simple way. There's a lot of problems and issues which we could take days to debate. But I wrote 2 poems when I was much younger, 35, 40 years ago, which indicated my wrestling with these questions. The first one is called Heraclitean. Now, all I'll say is that Heraclitus was a philosopher before Plato's time, very important, and he basically said that all things are in flux and moving and uncertain, and you can't step into the same river twice because the river, like all the other things in our world, are moving. And of course, we have reason to believe Heraclitus was more right than he thought, because now we see that atoms are moving and that things are moving even in the invisible spaces of nature, so that this universal motion seems to be an interesting insight. And therefore, time is the element in which we exist, because all things are by their nature mobile, and one thing can become another thing, and one thing can barely maintain its nature, even briefly, over time. So the Heraclitean side, which on the Greek side includes Democritus and the atomists and the Epicureans, is one dominant branch of Greek thought, and therefore Western thought, our whole Western culture thought. The other branch is the Parmenidean side, in which things are more still and determinate and singular and unified by some concept, whether being or some other term. And in that genus, we have Plato and Pythagoras. Aristotle is a unique figure in that he exists in both the Heraclitean and the Parmenidean family. Sorry for my lecture. I'm going to read the first poem, Heraclitean. I have been told by thoughtful men to meditate the moving face of nature, and with care to trace the lineaments of now and then. But studying love's better theme, I found this new world cruel and cold. My senses were not young nor old, but followed the insensate beam. Maybe if time is kind to those who do not understand her face, I'll sometime touch the moving grace of water as it quickly flows. What does the poem mean? Well, I was told by thoughtful men, philosophical people, reasonable men, that I should not be thinking about unchanging objects of thought, my native Platonism. I should be thinking about things that move, the face of nature, the temporal world. That's where knowledge is gotten, through the observations of that world. And I should carefully trace the lineaments, that's the structures, the boundaries of now and then, where temporal objects live in the present and in the past, an ever-moving scheme. That's what I should do. But, I say, and now this shows my own prejudice against the advice of these thoughtful men, but studying love's better theme, looking at love's better theme, meaning the divine created order's better theme, it's better idea, I found this new world cruel and cold. I found the world of change in which nothing is itself forever, but we live in appearance and flux. I found that cruel because we have to live with all of this inimical sense of combat and movement and contradiction. And I found it cold because it seemed to me not to have the warmth of the divine or eternal imprint in which things by their most fundamental nature are unchanging. My senses, I say, were not young or old. They were neither young, I wasn't young or old when I perceived an object of my own, but followed the insensate beam, followed the beam which is beyond the sensible, beyond the empirical. And then I say, trying to produce a kind of concord between the Heracliteans and the Platonists, and between the people who've advised me to be more interested in nature. Maybe, I say at the end, if time, the temporal changing world, is kind to those who do not understand her face, the Platonists like myself who don't quite understand a world of flux and change, maybe, I say, I'll sometime touch the moving grace. Maybe I will step in the river once of water as it quickly flows. Maybe I'll get that sensation of knowing the thing that's moving and changing. So I grant to my interlocutor that perhaps someday in my existence I'll have a broader sensibility and I'll have an interest in these changeable objects. And I wrote a second poem in that same era called Plato in Ohio. In one way, it's a comical poem because when I think of Ohio, I think of a place that's very real and palpable and physical and has a certain kind of set of memories of my childhood. And, you know, it's hard to believe that Plato is in Ohio. This was the underlying humor, that Ohio, its existence depends on an unchanging paradigm when it seems to be so deeply involved in things that are changeable, even trivial. Okay, and I'll say how I expressed this in the poem. Plato in Ohio. Fire at the edge of the primordium, dragged through the vast receptacle toward life, equivalent but not the same from birth as those ideal, unchangeable, clear forms. So I describe in the first 4 lines this basic Platonic idea that at the edge of the primordium, the space between the physical world and the eternal world, there's a fiery presence in which things unchanging become changing, or things unparticular become particular. These things are dragged, I say. They're dragged by the demiurge, this divine power. They're dragged through the vast receptacle towards life. So they're dragged through this receptacle of being, and they become particular and temporal, and they're dragged into the living world. the world we live in every day. They're equivalent, I say, but not the same from birth. Each of these examples is equivalent to those ideal, unchangeable, clear forms. Okay. They may get there, we may see the form of a thing in the unchanging, but there's only an equivocal relation between changeable and unchangeable objects, which is one of the deep problems of Platonism. And then I humorously switched to the everyday life of Ohio. Here in Ohio, dust rises. Mists of rain run on the hanging ivy of the porch. The bottles in the window gather ash. All things conspire against imminence. So now I'm in Ohio, and what happens? Well, there's both the dry and the wet, which are two of the qualities of the quaternion that Plato describes. There's dust that rises when you go outside, and there's some mist of rain that's running on the ivies on the porch. So I see all these movable things, dust in the wind, water on the ivy, and we're living in a world, obviously, of motion and change. And the bottles in the window gather ash. And ash, of course, is the burned out substance of a cigarette or of a cigar. And that ash is kind of what's left over from the object known as the thing in itself. It's like a metaphor. The bottles in the window gathered this ashy material on their bodies because people smoke in the house. All these things, all these Ohio things conspire. They're attacking the idea of immanence, the idea of the immanent presence of the immaterial, of the formal. And I asked the question, did Plato strive to fill a scarecrow's sleeve? I look around me, I see nothing but changeable appearances. I see something no more real and living and no more fundamentally knowable than a scarecrow, which of course is an unreal human, that merely an appearance of humanity which frightens birds and animals. And I asked the question, did Plato strive to fill a scarecrow's sleeve? Did he try to fill up with meaning, with the forms, this scarecrow existence? Ohio winces at his rhetoric. When we think of Platonism, Ohio seems impossible. It's like made painful just to think about the possibility of this eternal presence. His gorgeous nonsense, which is a phrase from the poet Coleridge, which is how he described Plato's writing. His gorgeous nonsense will evaporate beneath the fiery mantle of the sun. When we look at things the way they really are, this fiction of formalism will evaporate. So if we're in Ohio, the whole thing seems impossible. Under a brittle moon, which time must steal, and crescent upon crescent build again, his master spoke such sacred ravings once. Who now would grudge him the reality? Well, the moon's an interesting paradox, the Selene figure, because it's both complete and partial. It goes from crescent back to its wholeness, which became a Platonic metaphor for how appearances only indicate slowly the whole existence of the formal world. It was one of Plotinus's metaphors. So under a brittle moon, which time must steal, it takes the time each month, takes something away each day from the moon, and then it returns in a cycle. Under that moon, in those nighttime and evening conversations that Plato had in the street, that Socrates had in the street, his master spoke such sacred ravings. Once the master of Plato was Socrates, who was a kind of central intellectual figure, and who is said, if we believe it, it's said to produce the ethical and metaphysical theory that Plato follows. His master spoke such sacred ravings once. Who now would grudge him the reality? Who would begrudge a reality so perfect, so beautiful, such a set of solutions? What human being should begrudge a solution so much more economic than any other known solution to the meaning and the structure of things? Even if it were a fiction, somebody should feel an attachment to it. These airy forms which float about the earth are strange equivalences, perfect shades of what we often touch or taste or hear. These immaterial existences, which float somewhere outside of the temporal earth above it, are strange equivalences. They seem very unlike the temporal world. They're perfect shades or shadows. They're like weird angelic doubles of the material world. And of all the things we often touch or taste or hear, which is the avenues of sensation, which Plato claimed were not the primary ways in which we understand what things are. And then I add with the final line, these forms which we doubt and which we question, they are the ghost, the Geist. The ghost means the living spirit within the figure, that is the figure of sensation, that we fear. I'm saying the modern man fears a world so charged with meaning, and a world in which eternity defines all temporal things, in which we're bound to contemplate that which is outside of time as a source of that which is inside it. I'm claiming at my last line that that's a fearful thought for people living in the world we live in today.